What's that sound? Why, that's a clock. It's time for a book review. What book am I talking about today? David Grann's The WAGER. A tale of shipwreck, mutiny, and murder. Now, I will let you in on a secret. I started this book a while ago, after I finished Killers of the Flower Moon, which I've done a review on. And I took this book to England. Go West Ham United. Because I thought, what better book to read than a book about a Royal Navy ship. But then when I got on the plane for my 7.5-hour flight to London, check out my vlog for my London trip. I got on the plane and I realized that there were free movies. And instead of reading a book, which I thought I would finish on the flight over, I ended up watching 3 movies that I had not seen. And I also ended up staying out enough while I was in London that by the time I got to the hotel room, I was pretty tired. So I didn't read much. Then on my flight back, I watched 3 more movies. But I was considering, I thought this was going to be a good book to read while I was in London, on my way to London, away from London. And it would have been, but I didn't. So please forgive me. But before I talk about the book, I opened with the Westminster Chimes from Big Ben. And I did not know that that was the name of the chimes. I just thought when I heard it and I was walking across the bridge that, hey, Big Ben plays the same tune that some old clocks I had played. And then when I played that video for my parents, my dad's like, oh, Westminster Chimes. And I thought, huh, that makes sense. It's Westminster. Then I realized that's why they're called Westminster Chimes, because the tune is from the giant clock and bells and not from my little home clock when I was growing up. So I wish I would have included that video in my London vlog, but I didn't, so here it is now. Last video, the London vlog video, I had been in the United States for about 48 hours after my trip to London. What I wasn't saying, because I didn't want anybody breaking into my house at the time, was that I was also on vacation for a week. We were on the Outer Banks in Corolla, North Carolina, where my knife became magnetized during dinner. We saw some Coast Guard helicopters and some Coast Guard planes. They were all from probably Elizabeth City, the air station Elizabeth City, but they kept flying over. And, of course, we saw some dolphins. Now, I would have more footage, but I took my drone out one day to try to find a floaty that was lost by our neighbors on the beach, and I couldn't make it back. I lost my drone because of the wind. I couldn't beat the wind back to land. So all that footage I had of rays and really rays, I guess, is all I got, is lost because my drone was lost. And then, of course, no, I guess not, of course. And then we also saw some deer in our neighborhood. And Noelia got to go with her grandparents to check out the horses that live on the beach. Were lost from the Spanish long ago. So it was fun. And I also had the book to read there, but again, I did not read that much because when you're surrounded by family and the beach, you kind of find other things to do. But I wanted to. I read some on the trip. Actually, it was storming the final night, final night, something, that we were there, and I thought it was kind of cool to read about some of the storms while I was in a storm, although completely covered. So that's what I did. And I like this book. Other cool thing that happened On our way home, we stopped in Portsmouth, Virginia, and I had arranged for this. I talked to the commanding officer of the Coast Guard Cutter Vigorous a few days. Well, last time we were in North Carolina, we tried for this, but it just didn't line up timing wise. This time, timing worked great. So on our way back home, we stopped in Portsmouth, and my wife and daughter got a tour of my old ship. It was very cool because my time in the Coast Guard came before I was married and before Noah was born. So she just hears stories here and there. We don't talk about it a whole lot. But it was very cool for her to see the ship, and she swears that my ship's bigger than any other ship, which is not entirely accurate, but it's cool she thinks that. Actually, so here is Vigorous with other ships in Portsmouth. And here's a side-by-side that somebody else took a while ago of Vigorous tied up next to a destroyer, a U.S. Navy destroyer in New York for Fleet Week. You can kind of get a feel for how much smaller Vig is than some Navy ships. So, got home and finished the book today, and I really liked it. I've read a few kind of sea disaster books, some fiction, some nonfiction, but there is nothing that will make you appreciate being on land more than a book about a shipwreck. And that's what the WAGER is about. This takes place in 1740 and kicks off from Portsmouth in England, which is also kind of cool because I did take a train. If you saw the London vlog, I took a train from London to Portsmouth to see the HMS Victory, which was a little bit newer than the ships in this book. So, but some of the action in this book takes place in Portsmouth, which is kind of cool. All right, so this is taking place in 1740. If I say 18 or 19 something later, just remember, I mean 1740 something. 1740, and this is towards the beginning of the War of Jenkins' Ear. Or is it the 7 Years' War? No. The War of Jenkins' Ear. I know there's another name for it, which eventually was kind of overtaken by the War of Austrian Succession. But this is really pitting England against Spain, and especially in the Spanish colonies, holdings in the New World. And what this is going to be is a group of 5 ships under Commodore Anson. Side note, when I was in Portsmouth, there was a pub with the name Anson in it, and I had already read enough in this book to know that there was an Anson in this book. I didn't eat there because I wasn't sure if they were serving food at that point, but I saw it, so that's cool. All right, so there's 5 ships, a couple big ships, a couple smaller ships, and then a couple support ships, and they're going to try to take a major metal shipment from Spain. Spain has a galleon that regularly takes precious metals and gems from the holdings in South America and Central America and gets them back to the Empire, back to Spain, which they needed for financing their war. And this is a group of ships that is going to go from England around the tip of South America, which is Cape Horn, and then back up in the Pacific, where they are going to attack Spanish settlements and eventually take all that money. And the thing is, members of of these ships will get a percentage of the take, whatever it is. So they're all very excited about that. But going around the Horn, Cape Horn, is very dangerous. Very, very dangerous in this time. And that's where things really start to fall apart. Because we're in a time period where the whole propulsion system for these ships is wind. You can kind of use oars for smaller ships, but wind. And that means that they need to have the kind of wind they can travel with or against in a way. And to get around Cape Horn, they needed to have favorable sea conditions, which is pretty extreme there, and wind to be able to make it around. And they had a lot of trouble with that. They even had trouble getting out of England because of the wind. As this is happening, people are dying. A lot of people are dying. Now, how many people, Ryan? How many people died? A lot. In the end, out of 2,000 for all the ships in this group, 1,300 of them were dead. That's pretty rough when you're losing more than 50% of your fighting force. They didn't really have that much fighting going on. They lost them especially to scurvy. Scurvy? That doesn't sound real. It's real. It's real. All you have to do is consume vitamin C. Vitamin C. Eat an orange. Get some vegetables. But this is a time before people understood that. They didn't know what scurvy was, so people were losing teeth, going insane, their bodies were falling apart, and they were dying. And they had these scurvy outbreaks, which could very easily have been remedied with some citrus. Plant-based something. So, that's a major stumbling block, was that, and also some other I think bacteria that there was some kind of outbreak on their way out of England that also resulted in some losses. And then you have the regular everyday injuries of people falling out of the yardarms from the masts and dying in the sea. A lot of the people on these ships couldn't swim, surprising, but a lot of times still true in some situations, especially with fishermen in the United States, I've found. More people do not know how to swim that work on boats than you would expect. So, the WAGER is one of the ships, not the big ship, but it's one of the ships that eventually, because of a number of deaths, is captained by David Cheap. David Cheap was kind of selected by Anson to be the second in command on one of the ships, but as people have died, he's moved on up and he becomes the captain. While they're traveling around, while this group of ships is traveling around Cape Horn, two of them have to turn back. They're badly damaged, and they don't know why they turned around, but it's probably because they're close to destruction, but they don't know. Maybe they freaked out. Maybe they gave up on the mission. Whatever it was, we never really find out because they disappear. The WAGER starts to have very major problems as they're rounding Cape Horn. And they lose their masts, and they start taking on water, and eventually they lose sight of the rest of the fleet, which is now 3 other boats. And one, it was either morning, I don't know if it was morning or night or what time of day it was, but land was spotted, but they weren't sure if it was land, and the person who spotted it brought it up to one other person who looked and saw clouds and thought, it's just clouds, you're seeing things. Well, it turns out it was land, and the WAGER crashed onto rocks, and people, they have some boats that were in their ship. They got to land, and eventually we go back and forth to grab things from the ship to try to survive. And the ship fell apart, and they were stuck there for months and months and months without real food. This is an island called WAGER Island that's on the Pacific coast of Chile, but not very high up, very, very far south. And they were stuck there, and Captain Cheap still envisioned a time where they would be able to take the boats up the Pacific coast and meet at Chileo, I think is the name of the island, with the rest of their fleet and then help with the final mission. But what we find is even when the ship first crashed into the rocks, order fell apart pretty quickly. There was a group called the Successionists, and they just wanted to drink and get rowdy and crazy, and they even probably murdered a few people once they were on the island. But they split off and went to another part of the island, and we don't know a whole lot about them, probably because they weren't keeping logs. Well, we are following two separate groups that initially were one under Cheap, but eventually another sailor, the gunner, Berkeley, has natural leadership skills and convinces people that, look, we got to get out of here because we're going to die. We're running out of food. And Cheap is still intent on going into Spanish waters and possibly getting, killed or taken prisoner there, where Berkeley wants to, Bulkley, not Berkeley. Bulkley is really, he wants to try for Brazil, which would be safe for English sailors. And that's the split. It's essentially a mutiny. More and more people are going to Bulkley's side because they blame Cheap for what happened. They also think that Cheap is maniacal and wants to continue on with the mission, even though they're close to death and they're losing 10, 20 people a day. There's this period of a lot of tension on WAGER Island, which is what they name the island. And in that tension, there is it's really probably a mutiny, the unsuccessful mutiny, and Cheap shoots one of the midshipmen in the head that was drunk and pushing for a mutiny. Now, he shouldn't have done that. That would be straight up murder. And it was after that that the two groups split. The people who were loyal to Cheap and the Crown stayed with Cheap on the island, and everyone else, which was most of the people, left with Bulkley to head back around. They were going to cut through the Straits of Magellan and try to get to Brazil. These are extreme distances. To make that trek, they were going to be in a 50-foot boat that they constructed out of a 38-foot boat and extended on the island. And it was going to take months and months and months to make it to Brazil. And it wasn't going to look good. And they hit storms immediately. But it happened. They made it to Brazil. They were taken care of by the locals. Eventually they made it back to England, published their, especially Bulkley's, account of what happened. And that was that. Well, the months later, now we're talking like a year that they've been out and away, Cheap makes it back to England. It turns out that he and 4 others eventually made it to the mainland with the help of a local who is from a local tribe. I think they're called the Chonos. They don't exist anymore. They're wiped out. But they were held to Spanish holdings, taken prisoner, and then eventually at the end of the War of Jenkins' Ear, they were released. So they come back to England with a very different account, and that's the murder and mutiny. And Bulkley had already published a book that was based off his logbook that really took to task Cheap. So now we're looking at a court-martial in Portsmouth, England, that was going to find the facts. And then the facts were going to determine if the mutineers should be hanged or if Cheap is a murderer and should be hanged. There's a lot at stake here. Anson maybe a year before this, I think, had returned to England successful. We got to see some of his actions where he actually found the galleon and picked up what is the equivalent of $80 million of goods, metals, precious metals, and virgin silver and gold, and brought them back as a major victory for England, although it came nowhere close to the price of the number of years that they were out, away, the number of people that were lost in this expedition, and just the amount that the war cost the country. So he's also back. Well, I didn't know what was going to happen. I thought, okay, we're going to see one side win, one side lose. It turns out that once they were all called to account for what they did, the court-martial panel only focused on the loss of the ship. They didn't go into anything else. And the idea here is probably that they were trying to avoid any kind of embarrassment, especially after the positive Anson press. They really didn't want to have anything that could overshadow that. So in this court-martial, where they brought out the green tablecloth, which they still use for mass, in my experience. I haven't been massed, but there is a green tablecloth. All the questions were about the loss of the ship. And it was determined that there's nothing anybody could have done, really, to avoid losing the ship. And the one person who was kind of censured was the young lieutenant, who didn't report to the captain that there may have been land spotted, even though he looked and couldn't find the land when it happened. But they never addressed the mutiny, they never addressed the murder, and it's thought that that's just because it was going to be dredging up too many negative stories on either side about the Royal Navy, and would overshadow at least one positive story of Anson winning. So they got rid of it. They just kind of they didn't cover it up. It was a major story, but it was almost like a mulligan. No one went to jail. No one was hanged. And it was just kind of, the facts they reviewed were very limited, and that was it. So you're kind of left to decide what you think. What do I think? I think it was a mutiny. I think it's a mutiny under very tough conditions, and Cheap was probably stoking those mutiny flames. It doesn't change there's a mutiny, but it also, at some point people are more concerned about their lives. There was also this idea that maybe the crew thought that they weren't accountable to the chain of command anymore because they weren't being paid after the ship sank. And that was kind of the caveat that the court-martial used to keep this low-key. But it was horrible. I mean, the actual wreck, horrible. The conditions that these people lived through even before the wreck, horrible. Just understanding the kind of injuries that they would get, how scurvy was managed or understood, how people were treated. There's nothing in here that you would read and say, like, I want to go to sea. I want to be a part of that. And eventually there were a number of changes made to Royal Navy policies to avoid something like this happening again, and also to fix some of the mistakes that were made. Not all the mistakes, not all the poor culture. And if you've watched my review of White Jacket, there's still some stuff that needs to be remedied, both in the U.S. Navy and the Royal Navy. But this is, fairly important, although less well-known, shipwreck and follow-on story related to that. It would have been kind of cool to read while I was in London, but most of this took place in South America, so it wasn't really on location for most of the book. And It was a good read. I liked it. Some of the pace was slow here and there because it's really taking a lot of historical accounts. It really kind of builds up, much in the way that I felt Killers of the Flower Moon worked. Kind of set the stage and then went into it. That's kind of what this was. Early stages of any shipwreck book are pretty standard. They're using wind to move. There's storms. People get hurt. People get sick. And then the shipwreck happens. And then after that, that's when I think things get a little more unique. The Spanish fleet that was coming after them had the same issues going around Cape Horn and lost most of their fleet too through that action. So it's a very dangerous area. Still is. Not as dangerous with, the invention of propulsion systems that can get you through no matter what the wind is, but still a rough area. So I liked it. I gave it 5 stars. It was cool to read after having been in Portsmouth, England. I wish I would have been able to look for some of the spots from this book, although I don't know if that's possible while I was in Portsmouth. But after so recently going on HMS Victory and then reading about Royal Naval ships, it was pretty neat to do it in that order. So thank you for being here. It's nice to be home. It's nice to be in my own bed with my own pillow. That's the thing they don't tell you. Everyone says like where your bed is, but I noticed everywhere I slept, I was switching between pillows all night long. I wasn't getting like a good sleep. Once I got home and I put my head on my own pillow, it felt good again. And it was good to be home with family, see my wife and my kid. And I did bring home a number of things, not expensive things, but probably the 2 fanciest things I brought home was a coronation print teacup for my wife from Fortnum and Mason, and the Primrose print of Wedgwood from Harrods for my daughter. And they had tea last night, and I'll just let you see how cool the tea cups are and were being used. It was great. The last 2 weeks have been great, but it's good to be home too. And cheering for West Ham United and Middlesex Cricket Club. So thanks again. Have a good one. I will see you later. In my next book, I'll be reading about a plane crash in the water. Take a wild guess why I didn't read a book about a plane crash in water while I was flying to London. It was in my bag because I thought I was going to read more, but I was not going to do that kind of self-torture on my way over. So that would be my next book, called Drowning. Thanks. Bye.